Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The last amber rays of sunset filtered through the cottonwood leaves as Thomas Caldwell set his easel along the peaceful riverbank. The day's heat was finally yielding to evening's cool embrace, bringing with it the sweet relief that desert dwellers cherished after hours beneath the merciless sun. At 34, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade wandering the frontier with his sketchbooks and paints, capturing the raw beauty of landscapes most Easterners would never see. His quiet, methodical nature suited this solitary profession, finding beauty in places others merely passed through, giving permanent form to fleeting moments of light and shadow. The cottonwoods towering above him had clearly stood sentinel over this gentle bend in the river for generations. Their massive trunks, gnarled and textured with age, supported canopies of heart-shaped leaves that shimmered like silver coins in the faintest breeze. Thomas had been drawn to this particular spot for days, watching from a distance before finally gathering his courage to approach. Something about it called to him, perhaps the perfect composition of trees against sky, or the way late afternoon light dappled the slow-moving water with patterns that seemed almost deliberately arranged, like nature's own artwork. You couldn't have found a prettier spot if you'd searched the whole territory, came a gravelly voice from behind him. Thomas turned, startled from his concentration. He hadn't heard anyone approach, which was unusual given his heightened awareness of his surroundings. A necessary caution for a man who often worked alone in remote locations. The speaker was an elderly man, perhaps 70 or more, with a face weathered by decades of outdoor living. He wore the simple, practical clothing of a working man, though the quality cut and subtle details suggested someone who took pride in his appearance despite its functionality. "Didn't mean to surprise you, son," the old man said with a gentle smile that creased his face into familiar patterns. "Name's Elijah Holcomb. Been cooking for wagon trains and cattle drives in these parts, going on 40 years now." "Thomas Caldwell," Thomas replied, extending his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Holcomb." "Just Elijah is fine," the old man said, his handshake firm despite his years. "Or Cookie. Most folks on the trail called me that, so long I sometimes forget to answer to my given name." Thomas gestured to his half-completed sketch. "You're right about the location. I've been trying to capture it for days now. Something about these trees." Elijah nodded knowingly, approaching to stand beside Thomas as they both gazed up at the massive cottonwoods. "These old giants have stories to tell, if you know how to listen. First came through here in '55 with a wagon train bound for California. These trees were already ancient then, and they'll be standing long after both of us are gone." There was something in Elijah's tone, a reverence mixed with familiarity that suggested deeper connection than casual observation. Thomas recognized it immediately. He had encountered it before in people who had developed intimate relationships with particular landscapes through years of experience. "Are you camped nearby?" Thomas asked, realizing the old man must have come from somewhere. Elijah gestured vaguely downstream. "Got my little camp about a quarter mile that way. Nothing fancy. Just me, my mule, and enough supplies to keep body and soul together. Been wintering in these parts for years now. Too old for the long drives, but I still prefer sleeping under stars to any town lodgings. As they spoke, the light continued its gradual transition from the golden glow of late afternoon to the softer blue of approaching evening. Thomas worked quickly, trying to capture the particular quality of this transitional illumination before it faded completely. Elijah watched in respectful silence, seemingly content to observe the artistic process without interruption. Only when Thomas finally set down his charcoal, satisfied he had recorded enough detail to continue the work later, did Elijah speak again. "You planning to stay around these parts long?" Thomas nodded. "At least a few weeks. I have a small camp upstream a ways. Been traveling through the territory gathering material for a collection of landscape studies. Eastern publishers are hungry for authentic images of the frontier." "Well then," Elijah said with a smile, "perhaps you'd care to share a meal at my fire tonight. Nothing special, just beans and biscuits with a little bacon for flavor. But I've been told my coffee would wake the dead." Thomas accepted the invitation with genuine pleasure. Though comfortable with solitude, he had learned through years of wandering to appreciate the rare gift of company when it presented itself, especially from those who understood and respected the rhythms of contemplative work. As they walked along the riverbank toward Elijah's camp, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving the landscape bathed in the peculiar clarity of high desert twilight. The cottonwoods behind them stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, their distinctive shapes forming a natural cathedral over the flowing water. "Ever notice how water sounds different at night?" Elijah asked conversationally. "Same river, same rocks, but once the sun goes down, every ripple and bubble carries further, almost like the water's trying to tell you something." Thomas nodded, having observed this phenomenon himself during countless evenings spent beside rivers, streams, and creeks across the Western Territories. "I've often thought sound behaves differently after dark. Perhaps it's just that other noises fade away, allowing us to hear what was always there." "Maybe so," Elijah conceded. "Or maybe some things simply choose to speak when they know we're finally quiet enough to listen." This philosophical observation, delivered casually as they walked, captured Thomas's imagination. It suggested the old cook possessed a contemplative depth beyond his practical experience, an interior life enriched by years of observation and reflection. Elijah's camp proved to be a model of frontier efficiency, simple yet remarkably comfortable. A small canvas tent provided shelter if needed, though the clear evening suggested sleeping beneath the stars would be the preferable option. A well-established fire pit contained the remains of that morning's fire, carefully banked and ready to be brought back to life. Various cooking implements hung from a nearby branch, organized with the precision of a man who had prepared thousands of meals in similar circumstances. With practiced ease, Elijah rekindled the fire, its warm glow creating a circle of light that pushed back the gathering darkness. As promised, coffee was prepared first, the rich aroma filling the air as beans and biscuits were set to cook. Thomas offered to help, but Elijah waved him off with good-natured confidence. "Been doing this longer than you've been alive, son. Best help you can offer is to sit and tell me what brings an artist all the way out to this particular bend in the river. Plenty of pretty landscapes between here and wherever you started." Thomas settled on a conveniently placed log that clearly served as Elijah's regular seating, considering the question. "I'm not entirely sure myself," he admitted after a moment. "I was passing through on my way to sketch the mesas further west, but something about this place called to me. The quality of light, perhaps, or the way these cottonwoods stand against the sky." Elijah nodded as he worked, seeming unsurprised by the answer. These trees have a way of calling to certain folks. Not everyone hears it, mind you, but those who do often find themselves lingering longer than they intended. As darkness settled fully around them, the campfire's glow intensified, creating flickering patterns of light and shadow that danced across their faces. Above, stars emerged in the clear desert sky, brilliant pinpoints of light uncountable in their multitude. Somewhere in the distance, they ate in companionable silence for a time, the simple meal made extraordinarily satisfying by hunger, fresh air, and the peculiar alchemy of campfire cooking. Thomas had to admit that Elijah's reputation as a coffee maker was well deserved. The brew was strong yet smooth, with a complexity of flavor rarely found even in expensive city establishments. "You mention these trees have stories," Thomas said eventually, cradling his tin cup between his hands for warmth as the desert night cooled rapidly around them. "Have you heard them yourself?" Elijah's expression grew thoughtful as he gazed into the fire. "Some, yes. Been coming back to this spot for decades now, whenever my travels permit. Time was when this bend in the river served as a regular stopping point for wagon trains, trappers, traders, all sorts passing through these territories. Plenty of nights I've sat beneath those very trees, listening to tales told around fires much like this one." He paused, seeming to gather memories before continuing. "But that's not what you're really asking about, is it?" Thomas looked up, surprised by the old man's perception. "What do you mean?" "You're wondering about the whispers," Elijah stated matter-of-factly. "Whether I've heard them myself, or if they're just stories folks tell to make simple geography seem more mysterious." Thomas felt a curious mixture of embarrassment and relief at having his unspoken question so directly addressed. During his time in the nearest settlement, 15 miles back along the trail, he had indeed heard mentions of strange whispers said to be heard beneath the cottonwood grove, soft voices carried on the night breeze when no one was present to have spoken aloud. "I did hear such stories in town," he acknowledged, "though I assumed they were local folklore rather than something more." Elijah nodded, his expression neither dismissive nor credulous, simply thoughtful. "Most places that have seen enough human passage collect such stories. Mountains that sing, canyons that echo voices long silenced, trees that remember. Easy to dismiss as superstition or imagination. Harder to explain when you hear them yourself." The directness of this last statement hung in the air between them. Thomas waited, sensing Elijah had more to say, but needed time to find the right words. "First time I heard them was in the autumn of '62, the old cook finally continued, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a confidence. "I was traveling with a small wagon party, 3 families heading to Oregon late in the season. We stopped here for 2 days to rest oxen and mend equipment before the difficult stretches ahead." He paused, adding a small log to the fire, watching as it caught and flared briefly before settling into steady burning. "Second night, I couldn't sleep. Happens sometimes when you get older. Mind keeps turning even when the body's tired. So I walked down to the river, thinking to smoke my pipe and enjoy some solitude before another day of feeding hungry travelers. That's when I heard them. Voices soft as wind-blown leaves, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. Thought at first it was someone from our party, who'd had the same idea about night wandering, but when I looked around, there wasn't a soul to be seen." Thomas found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by Elijah's matter-of-fact delivery. The old man spoke without dramatic emphasis or obvious embellishment, simply relating experience as he remembered it. "What did you do?" Thomas asked when Elijah fell silent. "What any sensible man does when confronted with something he doesn't understand," Elijah replied with a slight smile. "I stood perfectly still and listened harder. This practical response, so characteristic of frontier pragmatism, made Thomas smile in return. No fleeing in superstitious terror, no elaborate supernatural suppositions, just heightened attention to observable phenomena. "And what did you hear?" Elijah gazed upward briefly, where stars now filled the vast dome of night sky. "Fragments, mostly. Never a complete conversation you could follow from beginning to end. A laugh here, a few words there, sometimes singing. Old trail songs mostly, the kind that make long miles pass easier. Nothing frightening or ominous, just echoes, I suppose you could call them. Like memories caught in the leaves and released when conditions are just right." The description resonated with Thomas, who had developed his own theories about how landscapes might retain impressions of significant human experiences, not through supernatural means necessarily, but perhaps through subtle physical changes, imperceptible to casual observation, yet persistent enough to influence atmospheric conditions or sensory perception under particular circumstances. "You believe they're echoes of actual people who camped here before? Actual conversations somehow preserved?" Thomas asked, curious about Elijah's interpretation. The old cook shrugged slightly. "I've had 40 years to think about it, and that's the explanation that seems most fitting to my mind. This bend in the river has seen hundreds, maybe thousands of travelers over generations. Native peoples first, then Spanish, trappers, traders, settlers. All those lives, all those stories told around campfires, all those hopes and fears and dreams spoken aloud beneath these very stars. Seems almost stranger to imagine all that human experience would leave no trace at all. This perspective, framing the phenomenon as natural continuation rather than supernatural visitation, offered an understanding that balanced mystery with rational possibility. Thomas found it deeply satisfying, aligned with his own sense that the natural world and human experience were more intricately connected than modern thinking sometimes acknowledged. "Have you ever heard them clearly enough to understand specific words? Complete thoughts?" he asked. "Occasionally," Elijah affirmed. "More often when the wind is right, coming from the east on clear, cool nights, most clearly in that hour just after midnight, when the world grows especially still." He studied Thomas with sudden intensity. "You're thinking you might listen for them yourself." It wasn't a question, and Thomas didn't treat it as one. "I'd like to try, yes. Not out of skepticism or to prove anything to anyone else, simply because..." He searched for the right words. "Because if voices from the past can still be heard in some form, I'd consider it a privilege to listen." Elijah nodded, seemingly satisfied with this motivation. Good attitude to have. Respect matters when approaching such things. Too many folks either dismiss possibilities outright or go looking to exploit mysteries for profit or reputation. They fell into comfortable silence then, listening to the night sounds around them. Crackling fire, flowing river, occasional rustling in surrounding vegetation as small creatures went about their nocturnal activities. Above them, the star-filled sky slowly wheeled in its eternal rotation, countless generations having gazed upward at the same patterns from this very spot. "You know," Elijah said eventually, "there's a fellow passes through these parts every few years. Calls himself a collector of stories rather than a teller of them, though he does both in my estimation. Sebastian James is his name. Strange fellow in some ways, but genuine in his appreciation for these territories and their hidden histories." "I've heard of him," Thomas replied with interest. "His published collections of frontier tales are quite popular back east. I've never had the pleasure of meeting him personally. Well, he has some interesting theories about the whispers. Says they're not just echoes, but unfinished stories seeking completion. tales interrupted by circumstance, death, disaster, or simply life's unpredictable turns that linger in places like this, waiting for someone to hear them properly. Elijah chuckled softly. Bit fanciful, maybe, but Sebastian has spent more time listening to them than most. 4 or 5 visits over the years, always staying several weeks. Sits under those cottonwoods night after night, writing in his journals. This image, a dedicated chronicler patiently recording whispered fragments night after night, captured Thomas's imagination. It suggested commitment to understanding rather than merely experiencing, transformation of fleeting phenomena into recorded knowledge that might otherwise be lost entirely. "When did you last see him?" Thomas asked. "About 2 years back," Elijah replied, "though I wouldn't be surprised if he appears again soon. He tends to return when the cottonwoods are at their fullest, which should be any time now." As their conversation continued into the night, Thomas found himself increasingly drawn to the mystery of the whispers. Not with the fevered excitement that sometimes accompanied tales of buried treasure or supernatural manifestations, but with quiet, contemplative curiosity, appropriate to subtle phenomena that revealed themselves only through patient attention. Eventually, as the fire burned down to glowing embers and the hour grew late, Elijah offered Thomas the hospitality of his camp for the night. The artist gratefully accepted, having already decided that relocating his own modest camp to this area would be his next day's priority. Something about this particular bend in the river, the ancient cottonwoods, the quality of light, the possibility of whispered stories carried on the night breeze, had captured his imagination more thoroughly than any landscape he had encountered in recent memory. As he settled into his borrowed bedroll beneath the vast canopy of stars, Thomas found himself listening with newfound attentiveness to the night sounds around him. The gentle rush of flowing water, the rustle of cottonwood leaves stirred by faint breeze, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, all seemed suddenly laden with potential meaning beyond their ordinary acoustic properties. Just before sleep claimed him, in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, Thomas thought he heard it, a soft murmur like distant conversation, words indistinct yet carrying unmistakable human cadence. Whether genuine phenomenon or product of suggestion combined with fatigue, the experience filled him with quiet wonder rather than apprehension. His last conscious thought was anticipation of nights to come, spent beneath the cottonwoods with sketchbook and pencil, ready to capture whatever mysteries this remarkable place might choose to reveal. The following days established a rhythm that suited Thomas perfectly. Mornings were devoted to painting, capturing the cottonwoods in early light when golden illumination transformed their silver-green leaves into shimmering brilliance against the deep blue sky. Afternoons often found him exploring the surrounding landscape, documenting smaller details that contributed to the area's distinctive character. The particular quality of river stones smoothed by centuries of flowing water, the varied textures of bark on trees of different ages, the delicate wildflowers that somehow found purchase in seemingly inhospitable soil. Evenings were spent in Elijah's company, sharing simple meals and complex conversations beside the campfire. The old cook proved to be a remarkable repository of frontier knowledge, practical skills seamlessly interwoven with historical perspective and philosophical insight developed through decades of careful observation. Without formal education, Elijah had nevertheless cultivated wisdom that Thomas, despite his years at Eastern art academies, found himself repeatedly admiring. And then there were the nights, the hours after Elijah retired to his tent and Thomas returned to his own small camp, now established beneath the largest of the cottonwoods, approximately halfway between Elijah's position and the original spot where they had met. These solitary midnight vigils became Thomas's most treasured time, though their purpose remained difficult to articulate, even to himself. On the third such night, it happened. Thomas had been sketching by lantern light, capturing the distinctive patterns of moonlight filtering through the cottonwood canopy, when he first became aware of the change. Not a sound, precisely, but an alteration in the ambient acoustic environment, as if the normal night sounds had subtly shifted to create space for something else. He extinguished his lantern immediately, allowing his eyes to adjust to the silver burr moon riding high above. Then he heard them, soft voices carried on the gentle breeze that stirred the cottonwood leaves above him, not emanating from any specific direction, but seemingly present within the air itself, as if the surrounding atmosphere had somehow retained impressions of words spoken long ago. Thomas remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe lest any movement or sound from him disrupt the delicate phenomenon. The voices remained frustratingly indistinct, clearly human in origin and cadence, yet individual words proved impossible to discern with certainty. Sometimes he thought he caught fragments, crossing before winter, or better days ahead, but these impressions dissolved upon closer attention, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. What registered more clearly was the emotional quality underlying the whispered sounds, a mixture of determination, hope, weariness, and wonder that seemed to embody the essential experience of those who had traveled these territories during earlier, more difficult times. Not specific narratives, but their emotional essence, distilled human experience, carried across decades through some mechanism Thomas couldn't begin to explain. For nearly 20 minutes the whispers continued, sometimes fading to near inaudibility, then strengthening briefly before subsiding again. Thomas made no attempt to record or transcribe what he heard, instinctively understanding that this experience was meant for immediate perception rather than documentation. Instead, he simply listened with complete attention, allowing the subtle sounds to wash over and through him like the gentle river flowing nearby. When silence eventually returned, normal night sounds gradually reasserting their familiar patterns, Thomas remained seated against the massive cottonwood trunk, processing what he had experienced. No dramatic revelation or supernatural communication, yet profoundly moving nonetheless. Connection across time with others who had sat beneath these same trees, gazing at these same stars, contemplating their own journeys through territories both geographic and spiritual. The following morning, Thomas debated whether to mention his experience to Elijah. Part of him worried that discussing the whispers might somehow diminish their mystery or influence his perception of future occurrences. Yet the desire to compare his experience with Elijah's eventually overcame this hesitation. As they shared coffee at Elijah's camp, Thomas described what he had heard, being careful to distinguish between actual perception and interpretive impression, reporting with the same observational accuracy he applied to his artistic work. Elijah listened attentively, nodding occasionally in recognition. When Thomas finished, the old cook remained thoughtfully silent for several moments before responding. "You heard them clearly for a first-time listener," he finally observed. "Took me 3 or 4 nights before I caught more than the faintest hints. Must be something about you that resonates with this place." Thomas considered this possibility. Perhaps artists develop particular sensitivity to certain environments, a necessary attunement to subtle qualities of light, atmosphere, and space that might pass unnoticed by others. "Could be," Elijah agreed, "or maybe the place itself chooses who it speaks to and when. I've known folks who camped here for weeks and heard nothing beyond ordinary night sounds." This suggestion, that the landscape might possess some form of selective communication would have seemed absurdly superstitious to Thomas before his arrival at this particular bend in the river. Now, having experienced the whispers himself, he found himself open to interpretations that expanded beyond conventional understanding of how reality operated. "Have you ever tried to respond to them?" he asked. "To speak back to the voices when you hear them?" Elijah shook his head. "Never seemed right somehow. More like I'm overhearing something not specifically intended for me. Privilege enough without inserting myself into their conversations." He paused, studying Thomas with unexpected intensity. Though Sebastian, the story collector I mentioned, he takes a different approach. Says he sometimes asks questions and gets answers, though not directly. Claims the whispers shift to address topics he introduces, like invisible participants responding to his presence in their ongoing dialogue. Thomas found this idea simultaneously fascinating and slightly troubling, suggesting interaction rather than mere observation, potential influence rather than passive reception. "And you? Do you believe that's possible?" Elijah shrugged slightly. "I believe Sebastian believes it. Man's no fool or fraud, at least not intentionally. Whether the responses he perceives exist independently or emerge through his own deep connection with this place." He left the sentence unfinished, implying the answer remained ultimately unknowable. Over the following nights, Thomas continued his solitary vigils beneath the cottonwoods, experiencing the whispers with varying clarity depending on atmospheric conditions. As Elijah had suggested, they seemed strongest when easterly breezes stirred the leaves during the deepest hours of night, that still point between midnight and dawn when human consciousness traditionally finds itself most receptive to subtle influences. During daylight hours, Thomas channeled these experiences into his artistic work, creating landscapes that captured not just the physical appearance of the cottonwood grove and river, but something of their essential character, the sense of accumulated time and presence that distinguished this particular location from superficially similar environments elsewhere. His sketches and paintings began to exhibit subtle qualities that even he recognized as different from his previous work. Deeper resonance, more complex emotional undertones, greater integration of physical detail with atmospheric impression. On his 7th night beneath the cottonwoods, Thomas made a discovery that shifted his understanding in unexpected directions. Unable to sleep despite physical tiredness, he had risen before midnight to sit beside the quietly flowing river. The moon was waning now, providing less illumination than during his first encounter with the whispers, but his eyes had grown accustomed to navigating this landscape in near darkness. As he settled against what had become his habitual tree, the largest cottonwood with massively buttressed roots forming natural seating perfect for long contemplation, his hand brushed against something unusual in the bark near ground level. Curious, he retrieved his small lantern from nearby, lighting it carefully to inspect what he had felt. There, carved into the tree's thick bark approximately 2 feet above ground level, was a set of initials surrounded by a crude heart, S plus M W W W W W W. Below this traditional declaration of affection were numbers that clearly represented a date, June 7, 1849. Thomas traced the carving gently with his fingertips, marveling at its remarkable preservation after more than 30 years exposed to natural elements. The cottonwood's slow growth and regular regeneration of outer bark layers had maintained these human markings with surprising clarity, tangible evidence of specific individuals having occupied this exact spot during a precisely documented moment in time. Extinguishing his lantern to preserve night vision, Thomas resumed his position against the tree, now acutely aware that he literally rested where others had sat decades earlier. Perhaps the very SPGs whose initials were permanently recorded in living wood. This concrete connection across time affected him deeply, transforming abstract awareness of previous human presence into specific, documentable reality. As if responding to this shift in perception, the whispers began earlier than usual that night, soft murmurs that seemed to emanate from the tree itself rather than being carried on the breeze. Again, individual words remained frustratingly indistinct, but the emotional quality registered with greater clarity than before, predominantly contentment and affection, suggesting significant positive experience associated with this particular location. Following intuition rather than predetermined plan, Thomas found himself speaking aloud, not loudly, but in normal conversational tone, addressed to the darkness surrounding him. "I see your marks in the tree," he said simply. "Your presence here is remembered." For several heartbeats, nothing changed. Then the whispers subtly shifted, still indistinct, but somehow more focused, as if his acknowledgement had been received and responded to in some ineffable manner. The sensation lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the ambient sounds returned to their previous patterns, present but generalized, without the brief impression of directed communication. The experience left Thomas simultaneously exhilarated and unsettled. Had he actually established some form of contact across decades, or merely experienced subjective impression shaped by suggestion and his own receptive state? The rational portion of his mind leaned toward the latter explanation, yet his artistic sensibility, accustomed to honoring intuitive impressions alongside empirical observation, remained open to more extraordinary possibilities. The following morning, Thomas expanded his investigation, carefully examining other cottonwoods in the grove. Several revealed similar carvings, not all romantic declarations, but various forms of human markings, names, dates, simple pictographs, even brief messages apparently intended for subsequent travelers. The earliest legible date he discovered was 1837. The most recent 1882, just 2 years earlier, suggesting continuous human visitation throughout nearly half a century. When he shared these discoveries with Elijah, the old cook seemed unsurprised, yet appreciative of Thomas's systematic documentation. "People have always felt need to leave their mark," he observed. "Some vain attempt at immortality, I suppose, or perhaps just reassurance that they actually existed in this vast emptiness. Seen similar carvings all across these territories, trees, rocks, canyon walls, anywhere that might preserve human passage beyond individual lifespans." Thomas nodded, understanding this universal impulse that transcended cultural boundaries and historical periods. "What strikes me most is how these specific markings align with the emotional qualities I've perceived in the whispers. Areas with romantic carvings correspond with impressions of affection or contentment, while trees marked with names alone often convey more generalized experience, determination, weariness, occasional wonderment." Elijah considered this correlation thoughtfully, making connections other listeners haven't documented before, at least not to me. Sebastian might have noticed similar patterns, but he guards his detailed observations quite closely. Raw material for future publications, I expect. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the story collector himself appeared the very next day. Thomas and Elijah were sharing midday meal in the shade of Elijah's camp when a solitary rider approached from the eastern trail. A lean figure mounted on a sturdy buckskin gelding, laden with saddlebags that suggested extended independent travel. "Speaking of apparitions," Elijah murmured with amused resignation, "here comes our mutual subject of discussion. Thomas watched with interest as the rider drew closer. Sebastian James proved to be a man of indeterminate middle age, somewhere between 40 and 60, with features weathered by outdoor living yet animated by lively intelligence that belied any suggestion of physical deterioration. His clothing was practical frontier attire, distinguished only by unusually well-filled saddlebags and the case-hardened leather dispatch box secured behind his saddle, presumably containing the precious journals in which he recorded his collected stories. Elijah Holcomb, the newcomer called as he approached, voice carrying clear delight at the encounter. "Still haunting this bend in the river, I see. Cannot decide if that represents admirable consistency or simple lack of imagination regarding alternative campgrounds." This greeting, delivered with obvious affection despite its teasing content, suggested long acquaintance between the men. Elijah rose to receive the visitor, his own expression reflecting genuine pleasure beneath mock indignation. Sebastian James, still wandering these territories, pretending to collect other people's stories while actually running from your own. Some things never change. He turned toward Thomas, making formal introductions as Sebastian dismounted. "Thomas Caldwell, this troublesome fellow is Sebastian James, collector of tall tales and occasional purveyor of truth when fiction proves insufficient. Sebastian, Thomas is an artist of considerable talent documenting these landscapes for publication back east." The two men shook hands, each assessing the other with the careful attention characteristic of those accustomed to solitary travel and selective companionship. Thomas found himself immediately drawn to Sebastian's evident intelligence and the hint of philosophical depth behind his frontier pragmatism, qualities similar to what he appreciated in Elijah, though manifesting through notably different temperament. "An artist," Sebastian exclaimed with apparent delight. "How fortuitous. I've long believed these territories deserve visual documentation equal to their written chronicles. Too many Eastern illustrators rely on imagination rather than observation, producing romantic fantasies bearing little resemblance to actual landscapes. This perspective, valuing accuracy while acknowledging inherent interpretive elements in any representation, aligned closely with Thomas's own artistic philosophy. I've made similar observations to publishers," he agreed, "though I find the challenge lies in capturing both literal appearance and essential character, what might be called the spirit of place, alongside its physical features." Sebastian's expression registered immediate recognition of this artistic challenge. "Precisely. The same difficulty faces writers attempting to convey these territories through words alone. Mere description falls short. One must somehow transmit the experience of place, how it affects consciousness, shapes perception, influences understanding." As the three men shared food and conversation, Thomas observed the easy familiarity between Elijah and Sebastian, different personalities united by mutual respect and shared appreciation for fronted landscapes and experiences. Their conversational patterns suggested history stretching back decades, references to shared encounters and acquaintances, providing glimpses of interconnected journeys across these territories during periods of remarkable transition. Eventually, Elijah asked the question Thomas had been considering. "What brings you back to this particular bend in the river, Sebastian? Besides the obvious appeal of my incomparable coffee and conversation, of course." And Sebastian's expression shifted subtly, still pleasant but touched by something more serious, even reverent. "The cottonwoods are calling again. Been hearing them in my dreams these past months. Time to listen more carefully to what they might be saying." This direct reference to the phenomenon Thomas had recently experienced himself created immediate connection between him and the story collector. Elijah, noting their shared interest, provided necessary context. "Thomas has heard the whispers himself, remarkably clearly for someone newly arrived. even found carvings in several trees that seemed to correlate with different qualities in the voices. Sebastian turned to Thomas with heightened interest. "You've noticed patterns in the manifestations, connections between physical markings and auditory impressions?" Thomas nodded, slightly hesitant to assert what remained subjective observation rather than demonstrable fact. Tentative correlations only. Different trees seem associated with distinct emotional qualities in the whispers, and those with specific carvings, particularly expressions of affection or contentment, often produce the clearest impressions. "Fascinating," Sebastian murmured, clearly intrigued by this systematic approach. "I've documented similar correlations myself, though approaching from narrative perspective rather than visual or emotional orientation. Certain trees consistently produce fragments of specific story types: romantic encounters, survival challenges, spiritual revelations. Your observations regarding emotional qualities add valuable dimension to understanding the phenomenon." As afternoon progressed toward evening, the three men continued their discussion, comparing observations, theories, and personal experiences regarding the whispers beneath the cottonwoods. Sebastian proved to be remarkably open about sharing his documented encounters, despite Elijah's suggestion that he typically guarded such information, perhaps recognizing in Thomas a kindred spirit approaching similar mysteries through different perceptual frameworks. By mutual agreement, they decided to maintain separate camps, Sebastian establishing his own small setup near the largest cottonwood where Thomas had discovered the earliest carvings, but committed to regular shared meals and ongoing exchange of observations. This arrangement balanced communal support with individual exploration, allowing each man to maintain personal relationship with the phenomenon while benefiting from others' perspectives. That night, with three attentive listeners now positioned at different points beneath the cottonwood canopy, the whispers seemed to gain unusual clarity, as if responding to concentrated collective attention with more distinct manifestation. Thomas, from his position midway between Elijah's camp and Sebastian's new arrangement, found himself receiving impressions of greater specificity than during previous encounters. One voice in particular emerged with surprising definition, female from its pitch and intonation, speaking words that Thomas could almost but not quite fully comprehend. The emotional quality registered clearly as reminiscent nostalgia mixed with quiet determination, someone recalling past experiences while facing uncertain future with measured optimism. The following morning, comparing notes with Sebastian, Thomas learned that the story collector had perceived similar specificity, though focusing on narrative content rather than emotional quality. According to Sebastian's careful documentation, he had distinguished fragments of a young woman's accounting of her journey westward, specific references to family left behind in Tennessee, hopes for new beginning in California, concerns about mountain crossings before winter weather closed viable passages. Martha Whitman, Sebastian stated with surprising certainty when Thomas inquired how he knew the speaker's identity. Traveled through in summer of 1849 with her husband Samuel. Their initials are carved in the largest cottonwood. I documented their story during previous visits through fragments gathered over many nights. Thomas recognized the initials immediately. Cess plus M.M.W., the very carving he had discovered during his earlier exploration. Samuel James and Martha Whitman, he murmured, connecting these specific historical individuals with the emotional impressions he had received while resting against the tree, bearing their declaration of affection. Their story continues beyond this place, Sebastian explained. Made it to California safely despite departing relatively late in the season. Established successful orchard near Sacramento. Raised 5 children according to territorial records I consulted years later. Samuel died in 1876, Martha in 1881, both having lived full lives despite hardships of their journey and early settlement years. This concrete information, transforming ethereal whispers into documented human history, affected Thomas profoundly. No longer abstract phenomena or nameless voices, but specific individuals whose life trajectories had intersected this particular bend in the river during precisely dated passage westward. Their carved initials, preserved in living wood, anchored their transient presence in physical reality that persisted decades after their bodies had continued their journey toward distant destination. Over subsequent days, Sebastian shared additional identifications, names attached to other carvings, fragments of personal histories reconstructed through years of patient listening and meticulous documentation, supplemented by historical research during his travels. Thomas began incorporating this knowledge into his artistic work, not literally illustrating these stories, but allowing their emotional resonance to influence his depiction of the cottonwood grove and river landscape that had temporarily contained their human dramas. In this collaborative exploration, Thomas with his visual sensitivity, Sebastian with his narrative documentation, Elijah with his lived experience of the territory's transformation over decades, a richer understanding of the whispers gradually emerged. Not supernatural manifestation in conventional sense, but subtle physical phenomenon involving specific combination of environmental factors. The cottonwood's unique cellular structure preserving acoustic impressions, the river's consistent ambient soundscape providing carrier medium, atmospheric conditions at certain hours creating optimal transmission of these preserved vibrations. At least this represented their best attempt at rational explanation, though all three men privately acknowledged that something more mysterious might be operating. Something beyond current scientific understanding, but not, therefore, necessarily supernatural in traditional sense. The universe, they agreed during evening philosophical discussions, likely contained many phenomena operating according to natural laws not yet discovered or comprehended by human investigation. 2 weeks into this remarkable collaboration, as Thomas's collection of cottonwood studies neared completion and Sebastian's journals filled with newly documented narrative fragments, Elijah announced his impending departure. Cattle drive requiring experienced cook would be passing through nearby settlement in 3 days' time, offering employment opportunity too valuable to decline as autumn approached. On their final evening together, the three men shared specially prepared meal beneath the cottonwoods, Elijah demonstrating culinary skills developed through decades of frontier cooking, Sebastian contributing rare coffee beans acquired during recent travels, Thomas providing sketched portraits of his companions as commemorative gifts. As night deepened around them, conversation naturally turned toward reflection on their shared experience, investigating the whispers. Each man had approached the phenomenon through different perceptual framework, artistic, narrative, experiential, yet together had developed understanding richer than any might have achieved individually. I wonder sometimes if that's what the whispers truly represent, Elijah mused, as they sat beside glowing embers of their final shared fire. Not just echoes of specific people who passed through, but reminder that all human experience connects across time when we take trouble to listen properly. Sebastian nodded thoughtfully. Individual stories matter, worth documenting, specific names, journeys, hopes and fears, but perhaps their collective whisper speaks something larger about human passage through these landscapes. Our brief presence against backdrop of cottonwoods that stand for centuries, rivers that flow for millennia. And yet, Thomas added, contemplating his nearly completed landscape studies laid carefully beside him, these brief human passages somehow transform natural features into something more than mere geography. These aren't just any cottonwoods or any river bend. but specific place where specific lives intersected, leaving traces that persist beyond physical presence. The three men fell silent then, listening to night sounds around them: flowing water, rustling leaves, occasional distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Above them, stars wheeled in familiar patterns, the same celestial map that had guided countless travelers across these territories, through countless generations. And beneath it all, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present for those who had learned to listen properly, came the whispers. Soft human voices carried on gentle breeze, telling their stories to the stars. Thomas Caldwell completed his collection of cottonwood studies the following week, 27 paintings and numerous supporting sketches documenting the remarkable landscape in various lights, atmospheric conditions, and seasonal transitions. Sebastian James departed 3 days after Elijah, continuing his perpetual wandering through the territories in search of stories requiring preservation before passing beyond living memory. Elijah Holcomb joined his cattle drive as planned, promising to return to the river bend when circumstances permitted, as he had done consistently for decades. Thomas himself eventually continued westward as originally intended, seeking new landscapes worthy of artistic documentation. Yet he returned to the cottonwood grove repeatedly during subsequent years, establishing seasonal residence that allowed continued exploration of its unique characteristics through changing conditions. His published collection, Whispers Beneath the Cottonwoods, Studies of a Western River, eventually brought this particular landscape to wider attention, though he deliberately omitted specific location details to preserve its essential tranquility. The whispers continued their gentle murmuring through seasons and years, sometimes clearer, sometimes fainter, but persistent in their quiet testimony to human passages through seemingly empty landscapes. Old voices gradually faded as new ones emerged, continuing cycle of brief presence against backdrop of enduring natural features. Travelers still occasionally carved their initials into receptive bark, adding contemporary signatures to historical record preserved in living wood. And sometimes, on particularly clear nights when easterly breezes stirred silver-green leaves just so, listeners with proper patience and receptivity might distinguish specific fragments among the generalized murmuring, perhaps Martha Whitman recalling Tennessee springtime, or Samuel James describing California dreams, or any of countless others whose brief rest beneath ancient cottonwoods left subtle impressions that outlasted their physical presence. Not ghosts exactly, nor supernatural manifestations in traditional sense, but persistent human echoes resonating through landscape that received, preserved, and occasionally released impressions of lives that had touched it briefly, yet significantly, during their western passages. The whispers beneath the cottonwoods continued their gentle testimony that no human journey passes without leaving traces, that every story told beneath the stars somehow persists for those who learn to listen with proper attention and respect. As the whispers beneath the cottonwoods continued their eternal murmurs, carrying stories across time to those who would listen, other tales waited to be told across the vast frontier. The land itself held memories, not just in the rustling leaves of ancient trees along riverbanks, but in the weathered timbers of abandoned towns, the creaking boards of forgotten saloons, and the silent testimony of structures slowly returning to the earth from which they rose. While Thomas Caldwell captured the living whispers of travelers beneath the cottonwoods, another story was unfolding many miles away, where time moved at a different pace. In a place where dust danced in slanting sunlight through broken windows, and where silence had a presence all its own, there, in the ghost town of Tumbleweed, the slow dance of dust and time kept its own rhythm, preserving moments long after the people who created them had moved on. Just as the cottonwoods guarded their stories for those patient enough to hear them, the abandoned buildings of Tumbleweed stood as silent witnesses to dreams that had flourished briefly before fading away. And it was to this place that Amos Blackwood, a man with his own history etched into the lines of his weathered face, now journeyed, seeking answers to questions he had carried for decades. Where the whispers beneath the cottonwoods spoke of journeys beginning and hopes for the future, the slow dance of dust and time in Tumbleweed told of endings, of paths diverted, and sometimes of ghosts that refused to depart entirely. Each story held its own truth, its own beauty, and its own gentle lesson for those willing to listen with an open heart. And so we turn from the silver-green leaves of the cottonwoods to the golden light of a setting sun as it stretches across weathered boardwalks and leaning facades, casting long shadows that reach through time itself. The day's last light filtered through the weathered planks of the old barn, casting long golden fingers across the dirt floor. Joshua McKay paused in the doorway, fiddle case clutched in one hand, saddlebag in the other, as his eyes adjusted to the dimness within. The journey from Blackwater had been longer than expected, his horse favoring its right front leg just enough to slow their progress. And with night coming on and storm clouds gathering to the west, the abandoned barn had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Outside, the wind chased tumbleweeds across the overgrown field that had once been prime grazing land for the cattle of Willowbrook Ranch. The small settlement that had grown around it, hardly more than a whispered memory now, had enjoyed brief prosperity during the cattle boom before the railroad changed everything. All that remained was this barn, a stone foundation where the main house had stood, and stories that the old-timers told in hushed voices when the evenings grew long. Joshua set his belongings down carefully and began a cautious exploration of the space. Despite the partial collapse of the western wall and the obvious neglect of decades, the main structure remained surprisingly sound. Overhead, massive beams crossed the ceiling, still bearing the weight of the hayloft, though it had long since emptied of its sweet-smelling cargo. Faded fabric strips hung from several of the crossbeams, remnants of decorations from celebrations long past, their colors dulled by time and dust but still discernible as the festive banners they once were. He ran his fingers along one of the support posts, feeling the smooth indentation worn by countless hands that had leaned against it during dances and gatherings. The wood retained a subtle warmth despite the cool evening air, as if it somehow remembered the human touch and held that memory close through all the silent years. Well, Joshua murmured to himself, his voice seeming loud in the stillness, could have found worse shelter for the night. He had been on the road for nearly 3 weeks now, traveling from settlement to settlement with his fiddle and his stories, earning enough for meals and the occasional bed by playing in saloons and at gatherings. It wasn't a life he had chosen exactly, but one that had chosen him, after the family ranch failed and his brothers headed west to California. Music had always come easily to him, and on the frontier a man who could coax a tune from horsehair and catgut rarely went hungry. The life of a traveling musician suited Joshua in many ways. He enjoyed the freedom of the open road, the changing landscapes, the brief but often meaningful connections formed with strangers who became temporary friends in the shared communion of music. Yet lately, he had felt a growing restlessness, a sense that something was missing, though what that something might be remained frustratingly unclear. As he arranged his modest camp for the evening, Joshua's attention was repeatedly drawn to the curious way the fading sunlight illuminated the dust motes floating in the air. Rather than the random drift he would have expected, they seemed to move with unusual purpose. swirling in graceful spirals and loops that reminded him, oddly enough, of dances at a country social. He paused, watching the phenomenon with mild fascination before shaking his head at his own fancy. Trail weariness playing tricks, no doubt. Once he had laid out his bedroll and gathered a few pieces of fallen wood from the barn's interior for a small fire, Joshua settled himself against his saddle and opened his saddlebag to retrieve his meager provisions. A heel of bread, a bit of dried venison, and an apple slightly bruised from travel would constitute his evening meal. As he ate, the gathering darkness deepened the shadows around him until only the small circle of his fire offered illumination. The wind had picked up, moaning softly around the eaves of the barn and causing the structure to creak and settle in the cooling night air. Joshua's horse, tethered nearby, nickered softly at a particularly loud groan from the timbers, but seemed otherwise content with the fresh hay Joshua had discovered in a still intact stall. "Don't worry, girl," he called softly to the mare. "This old place has stood against worse winds than this, I'd wager." His voice echoed slightly in the vast interior space, emphasizing his solitude rather than diminishing it. Strange, he thought, how different the quality of aloneness felt in various settings. Alone on the trail felt natural, proper, a man and his horse moving through vast landscapes in harmonious independence. Alone in an abandoned building, however, carried a different weight. Here the absence of others seemed an abnormal state, a departure from the structure's intended purpose. Finished with his simple meal, Joshua found himself reluctant to seek sleep just yet, despite the long day's ride. Something about the barn, perhaps its lingering sense of human presence despite obvious abandonment, stirred his curiosity. On impulse, he reached for his fiddle case, unlatched it, and withdrew the instrument that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. The familiar weight of it against his shoulder brought immediate comfort, like the embrace of an old friend. He drew the bow across the strings experimentally, making minor adjustments to the tuning that the day's travel had disturbed. The notes seemed to fill the empty space of the barn differently than they did the open air of the trail or the crowded confines of a saloon. Here they lingered, resonating against the wooden walls and beams with a warm, intimate quality that pleased him. Without consciously deciding what to play, Joshua found his fingers moving into the opening notes of Shenandoah, a song that always brought to mind rivers winding through valleys and the ache of distance from those left behind. The melody unfurled slowly in the darkness, each note hanging in the air before reluctantly surrendering to the next. As he played, Joshua closed his eyes, letting muscle memory guide bow and fingers while his mind drifted with the music. When he opened them again, something had changed in the quality of light around him. Though his small fire remained the only source of illumination, the dust motes he had noticed earlier now seemed to glow with a faint luminescence of their own. They moved more purposefully too, the swirling patterns he had attributed to random air currents, now unmistakably rhythmic. Joshua faltered momentarily, his bow stuttering across the strings, but the compelling strangeness of what he witnessed drove him to continue playing. As the melody found its footing again, the illuminated dust resumed its dance, spiraling and dipping in graceful arcs that traced the outlines of what his mind increasingly recognized as human forms. Spectral dancers, moving to his tune. Rather than fear, Joshua felt a curious sense of privilege, as if he had stumbled upon something precious and rare. He transitioned smoothly into a gentle waltz, curious to see how the dust dancers would respond. They adjusted immediately, the swirling patterns becoming more defined, more clearly suggestive of couples, turning in time to the triple meter of the dance. The sight was mesmerizing, beautiful rather than frightening. and Joshua found himself smiling as he played, his fatigue forgotten in the wonder of the moment. He experimented further, shifting into a lively reel, and watched in amazement as the dust responded, its movements quickening to match the faster tempo. The dancing forms seemed to multiply, filling the space before him with their silent revelry. It was as if his music had awakened memories embedded in the very air of the barn, releasing them from some form of suspended animation into brief, glorious life once more. So absorbed was he in the phenomenon that the sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered until they stopped just outside the barn. Joshua lowered his fiddle, the music ceasing abruptly. Without its guiding rhythm, the luminous dust dispersed, returning to ordinary motes catching the firelight as they settled slowly back to the floor. The spell broken, Joshua tensed, suddenly aware of his vulnerability as a lone traveler in an isolated place. "Hello, the barn," called a voice from outside, male, elderly, with the distinctive drawl of someone who had spent a lifetime in these parts. "I mean no harm. Just heard the music and wondered who might be playing in Willowbrook's old dance barn." Joshua relaxed slightly, though caution kept his hand near the revolver at his hip. "Come in then," he called back. "Fire's small but warm enough." The barn door creaked wider, admitting a figure that seemed to match the voice perfectly. An elderly man, slight of build but straight back despite his years, dressed in clothes of a style popular 2 decades earlier but well maintained. He carried a small lantern that illuminated a face weathered by sun and wind into a complex geography of lines and hollows. Sharp eyes peered out from beneath bushy white eyebrows, taking in Joshua and his camp with a single practiced glance. "Evening," the old man said, approaching the fire with the unhurried gait of someone with nowhere particular to be. "Theodore Willard. Most folks just call me Old Theo." He gestured toward the fiddle still in Joshua's hands. "That was mighty fine playing. Been some years since this place heard music like that." Joshua introduced himself, then motioned to the space opposite him by the fire. "You're welcome to share my camp, Mr. Willard. Not much in the way of comfort, but it's dry at least." The old man nodded appreciation and lowered himself carefully to sit cross-legged on the ground with surprising limberness for his age. He set his lantern beside him, its light combining with the fire to push back the darkness a few more feet. "I heard Shenandoah first, then that waltz. Reminded me of something they used to play here, back when this place was the heart of every social for 20 miles around." Joshua's interest quickened. "You knew this place when it was still in use?" Old Theo chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Knew it? Boy, I was the one who called the dancers here for near 30 years. From 1878 right up until the place closed in 1905. Pride momentarily straightened his already upright posture further. Nobody could run a Virginia reel like Theodore Willard, that's what they said. "A dance caller," Joshua said, understanding dawning. "I wouldn't have thought this isolated ranch would have hosted formal dances." "Wasn't always isolated," Theo corrected mildly. Willowbrook was the center of everything once upon a time. The main house could sleep 20 guests, and often did when the seasonal dances came around. Spring planting dance, midsummer dance, harvest dance, Christmas dance. Folks would travel 2 days just to attend. He gazed around the darkened barn with eyes that clearly saw it as it had been, rather than as it was now. This floor would be polished, smooth as glass, lanterns hanging from every beam, tables along that wall there laden with food enough to feed a small army. As he spoke, Theo gestured with gnarled hands that still retained the expressiveness of a caller. Hands that had guided countless dancers through complex figures, maintaining order in the controlled chaos of a crowded dance floor. Joshua could almost hear the phantom echoes of those calls, the rhythmic instructions floating above the music, the responding laughter and footfalls of dancers following their patterns. The old man's words painted a vivid picture, bringing the empty space around them temporarily back to life in Joshua's imagination. He could almost see the barn as it must have been, gleaming with light, filled with music and laughter, the center of community life, in a place that valued such gatherings as rare respites from the isolation and hardship of frontier existence. Must have been something to see, Joshua observed, encouraging the old man to continue. That it was, Theo agreed, his expression softening with memory. Nothing like it. Not before, not since. The whole territory's social calendar revolved around Willowbrook's dances. Folks would start planning weeks ahead, what they'd wear, who they might dance with, which dishes they'd bring for the communal feast. He smiled faintly. Many a marriage began with eyes meeting across this very floor. Many a business partnership formed during conversations between dancers. Many a feud resolved when enemies found themselves paired as partners by my deliberate calling. What happened? Joshua asked quietly, sensing an untold story in the gap between that vibrant past and the abandoned present. Theo was silent for a long moment, his gaze turned inward to memories only he could see. Progress, he finally said, the word carrying neither bitterness nor acceptance, merely stating fact. Railroad came through 15 miles south instead of here like everyone expected. New town grew up around the station. Then the drought of 1903 hit hard, and the ranch never really recovered. By 1905, the family had sold most of the land, and the dances stopped. By 1912, the place was abandoned entirely. He sighed softly. That's the way of things, I suppose. Nothing stays the same, no matter how much we might wish it. Joshua nodded understanding, all too familiar with how quickly fortunes could change on the frontier. His own family's ranch had suffered a similar fate when the market for cattle collapsed just as they had invested heavily in expanding their herd. Many nights during his travels he had passed through ghost towns and abandoned homesteads, each representing someone's broken dream, someone's forced surrender to the harsh realities of frontier economics. So what brings you back here now? He asked. Seems a long ride just for memories. The question seemed to catch the old man by surprise, as if he hadn't fully articulated his own reasons even to himself. Habit, maybe, he admitted after consideration. Or obligation. I come back every year on this day, June 2nd, anniversary of the last dance ever held here. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in cloth, which he carefully unwrapped to reveal 3 candles. I light these, sit a spell, remember those who danced here. Especially 2 in particular. Joshua watched curiously as Theo placed the candles on a flat stone near the fire and used a twig to transfer flame to each wick. The additional light further pushed back the darkness, illuminating more of the barn's interior. As the flames steadied, Joshua noticed the dust motes beginning to stir again, though not with the same organized patterns he had witnessed earlier. There's a story about this place, isn't there? Joshua prompted gently, sensing the old man had more to share. Something special about that last dance? Theo's gaze, watching the candle flames, grew distant. Not just a story, he corrected. True account, as I live and breathe. Witnessed it myself. He settled more comfortably, clearly preparing for a longer telling. The last dance was supposed to be a grand affair, a final celebration before the Willowbrook estate was formally dissolved. Invitations went out to everyone who had ever attended the seasonal gatherings, and preparations were made as if it were the grandest ball the territory had ever seen. But fate had other plans. Outside, the wind picked up momentarily, causing the barn to creak and the candle flames to flicker. Both men paused, listening as the gusts subsided, before Theo continued. Thomas Sheridan and Elizabeth Winters had been sweethearts since childhood, grew up on neighboring ranches, expected by everyone to marry as soon as he established himself properly. Thomas had been working as foreman at Willowbrook for 3 years, saving every penny. The night of that final dance, he planned to announce their engagement formally. Theo smiled faintly at the memory. He'd confided in me weeks earlier, asked me to play their favorite waltz for the last dance of the evening so he could lead her to the center of the floor and propose, proper, in front of the whole community. Joshua nodded encouragement, caught by the stories unfolding. Though he had heard many tales in his travels, something in Theo's manner suggested this one carried special significance, both to the teller and perhaps to the place itself. Thomas was a fine young man, Theo continued, his voice warming with approval. Hard-working, honest, respected by the hands he supervised and the ranchers he dealt with. Elizabeth was his match in every way, spirited but kind, practical but not without dreams. They complemented each other, balanced each other. Everyone saw it, everyone approved. Their marriage wasn't just a personal union but a binding together of 2 important local families, a strengthening of the community as a whole. The old caller's expression sobered. But that morning, word came that cattle from the southern range had broken through a fence and scattered. Thomas rode out with several hands to round them up before the storm that was threatening could make matters worse. "I'll be back in plenty of time for the dance," he told everyone. "Save the last waltz for me and Elizabeth." Joshua could sense where the story was heading, but remained silent, allowing Theo to tell it in his own way. The storm came in faster and harder than anyone expected. By afternoon, it was clear the men wouldn't be back until well after dark, if then. Elizabeth waited at the main house, dressed in her finest, watching the road from the window as guests began to arrive. The dance commenced without Thomas and the others, everyone assuming they had found shelter somewhere on the range and would return once the weather cleared. Theo paused, reaching out to adjust one of the candles that had begun to list to one side. The evening wore on, and still no sign of them. Elizabeth danced mechanically with various partners, but her eyes never left the door. As midnight approached, the traditional time for the last dance, I could see her hope fading, but just as I was about to announce the final number, the barn doors burst open. Joshua leaned forward slightly, caught up in the tale despite himself. "It wasn't Thomas," Theo continued, confirming Joshua's suspicion. "It was Ryan Milligan, one of the hands who had ridden out that morning, soaked through, exhausted, his horse half dead from hard riding." The news he brought silenced the music and laughter immediately. During the roundup, Thomas's horse had been spooked by lightning and thrown him in rough country. He'd struck his head on a rock in the fall. The old man's voice grew softer. He was gone before Ryan could reach him. "Elizabeth?" Joshua asked quietly, after a respectful pause. Collapsed right there on the dance floor. When she recovered, she was different. Calm in a way that frightened those who knew her well. She asked, insisted really, that the final dance proceed as planned. "Play our waltz," she told me. The one Thomas requested. People tried to dissuade her, but she was adamant. Theo's eyes took on a faraway look, seeing not the ruined barn around them, but the scene from his memory. "So I announced the final waltz, Moonlight on the Prairie, their favorite, and the musicians began to play. Elizabeth walked alone to the center of the floor and began to dance by herself, perfectly composed, moving as if partnered by an invisible presence. The old man shook his head slowly in remembered wonder. And here's the thing that those who were there never forgot, never could explain. As she danced, the dust motes in the air around her, lit by all those lanterns hanging from the rafters, began to move with her, not just floating random, but swirling in patterns that suggested the form of a man dancing with her. Some swore they could make out Thomas's features in that dust. Joshua felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. He recalled what he had witnessed earlier while playing, the strange, purposeful movement of the illuminated dust. When the waltz ended, Elizabeth curtsied to her invisible partner, walked with perfect dignity to the door, and left without a word to anyone. She never danced again, never married, lived another 47 years, most of them right here in the territory. But something essential in her remained in this barn that night, dancing eternally with the man she lost. Silence fell between them as the tale concluded. Joshua found himself studying the dust visible in the combined light of fire and candles, searching for patterns in its movement. For a moment he thought he detected a faint swirl that couldn't be attributed to their breathing or the subtle air currents within the barn, but it dissipated before he could be certain. "That's why you come back," Joshua said finally. "Not just to remember, but because you believe they're still here somehow, still dancing." Old Theo didn't confirm or deny this directly. "I call it paying respects," he said simply. "To Thomas and Elizabeth, yes, but also to everything this place represented. Community, tradition, moments of joy carved out of hard existence." He fixed Joshua with a penetrating gaze. "You felt something when you played earlier, didn't you? Saw something in the way the dust moved." It wasn't a question so much as a statement, as if Theo had somehow witnessed Joshua's private experience before arriving. Joshua hesitated, then nodded slowly. It was like the air itself was dancing to the music, forming shapes, following the rhythm. The old collar smiled, a genuine expression that softened the weathered contours of his face. "Then you understand why I return. Some things can't be explained, only experienced. Some connections don't end with death or time." "Have others seen it?" Joshua asked. "The dancing dust, I mean." Theo shook his head. "Not that I know of. Oh, there've been travelers who've sheltered here over the years, as you have. Cattle hands, drifters, the occasional hunter, but none ever mentioned seeing anything unusual." His gaze grew thoughtful. "Though I've always suspected the dust only dances to music, and true music has been rare here since the dances ended." "By true music, you mean music played with heart and skill both," the old man clarified. "Mechanical reproduction wouldn't do it. Those talking machines they have now recording sound onto wax cylinders, and a drunkard scraping at a fiddle wouldn't call them forth either. It needs," he searched for the word, "intention, understanding, a kind of respect for what music means beyond just notes strung together." Joshua nodded, grasping the distinction Theo was making. As a musician himself, he knew the difference between technically correct playing and music that carried genuine emotional communication. It made a peculiar sense that if any phenomenon relied on music as catalyst, it would respond to the latter rather than the former. They sat in companionable silence after that, each man absorbed in his own thoughts as the fire burned lower and the candles gradually melted down. Outside, the threatened storm seemed to have passed by, the wind dying to an occasional whisper around the eaves. Joshua's mare had settled in her temporary stall, occasionally shifting weight, but otherwise content. Eventually, old Theo sighed and began to rise. "Dawn comes early, and I've a long ride back to town," he explained. gathering his lantern. "But I'm glad for the company tonight. Been many years since I shared this vigil with anyone who might understand." Joshua stood as well, oddly reluctant to see the old man leave. "I'm grateful for the story," he said sincerely, "and honored to be trusted with it." Theo nodded acknowledgement, then hesitated at the edge of the firelight. Would you play it? Their waltz? Moonlight on the Prairie? I haven't heard it performed properly in many years." The request came diffidently, as if he expected refusal. "I know the tune," Joshua confirmed, already reaching for his fiddle. "My grandmother taught it to me. Said it was popular at dances when she was young." The old collar's expression brightened. "If you wouldn't mind then, one last time before I go." Joshua positioned the instrument against his shoulder and drew the bow across the strings, finding the melody with practiced ease. Moonlight on the Prairie was a gentle waltz, its simple structure belying the emotional resonance created by the alternation between minor and major passages. It spoke of longing and fulfillment, separation and reunion, all within the framework of its flowing 3/4 time signature. As the music filled the barn, Joshua watched with a mixture of anticipation and wonder as the dust motes around them began to stir once more. Gradually, the random particles organized themselves into the swirling patterns he had witnessed earlier, but now, whether due to old Theo's presence or the specific tune being played, the forms they suggested were more defined, more clearly reminiscent of human figures moving in coordinated dance. Theo stood transfixed, his expression a complex blend of emotions, grief, joy, wonder, acceptance, as he watched the luminous dance unfold in the space between them. Tears tracked unheeded down his weathered cheeks, catching the light of the dying fire. "There they are," he whispered, barely audible above the music, "still dancing after all these years." Joshua continued playing, moving through the waltz's repeated sections with subtle variations in emphasis and ornamentation, as any skilled dance musician would. The dust dancers responded to these nuances, their movements becoming more elaborate, more distinctly human with each passing measure. In the swirling patterns, Joshua could almost make out individual features: a woman's profile, the set of a man's shoulders, two forms moving in perfect harmony to the music he created. As he played the final iteration of the melody, Joshua felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the barn, a deepening of the already profound sense of presence, as if more than just Thomas and Elizabeth had joined their silent audience. He had the distinct impression that the dust dancers had been joined by others, invisible but present, gathering to witness this rare reunion of music and memory in a place that had once been the heart of their community. When the final notes of the waltz faded, the luminous dust hung suspended for a moment longer, as if reluctant to relinquish its brief animation. Then, gradually, the particles dispersed, settling back into ordinary random movement before disappearing altogether in the low light. Old Theo exhaled slowly, seeming to return from some distant place. "Thank you," he said simply, the words weighted with emotion. "That was exactly what I needed." He straightened his shoulders and adjusted his hat, composure returning. "I should go, but I'm glad our paths crossed tonight, Joshua McKay." "ASMI," Joshua replied honestly. "Safe journey back to town." The old caller nodded farewell, then turned and made his way out of the barn, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. A few minutes later, Joshua heard the soft departure of hoofbeats as Theo began his journey home. Left alone once more, Joshua added the last of his gathered wood to the fire and settled back against his saddle. Sleep seemed distant despite his physical weariness, his mind too full of what he had witnessed and the story he had heard. He found himself wondering about Thomas and Elizabeth, what their lives might have been had fate not intervened, how their story had become so deeply entwined with this place that echoes of it remained decades later. Without conscious decision, he raised his fiddle again and began to play. Not Moonlight on the Prairie this time, but a slow, contemplative melody of his own creation that emerged note by note from some deep well of empathy within him. As he played, the dust began to stir once more, but differently than before, not forming distinct human shapes now, but creating gentle currents that flowed around him like a protective cocoon, responsive to the music yet with a quality that suggested presence rather than mere physics. Joshua played until his fingers grew tired and his eyelids heavy, the melody evolving naturally into something soothing rather than sorrowful. When he finally set the fiddle aside and prepared for sleep, the dust settled with him, creating a stillness that felt companionable rather than empty. As he drifted towards slumber, Joshua thought he heard something on the very edge of perception. Not quite sound, not quite feeling, but a distinct impression of gratitude that seemed to emanate from the barn itself. Whether his mind had been influenced by old Theo's tale or something genuinely supernatural had occurred, he found he didn't need to decide. Some mysteries were better appreciated than solved. Morning arrived with the soft insistence of sunlight filtering through the gaps in the barn's eastern wall. Joshua woke feeling more rested than he had in weeks despite the hard ground beneath his bedroll. For a moment he lay still, reorienting himself and recalling the events of the previous evening. In the clear light of day, the dancing dust and old Theo's tale might have seemed like the product of exhaustion and suggestibility, yet Joshua found he believed in their reality completely. He stretched, muscles protesting slightly after the long ride followed by sleep on the unyielding earth, then rose to tend to his morning necessities. His mare greeted him with a gentle nickering, apparently as refreshed by the night's rest as he felt himself. As he fed and watered her from his limited supplies, Joshua found himself speaking aloud, sharing his thoughts as if the horse might understand, or perhaps as if someone else might be listening. "Strange business last night, girl," he murmured, stroking the mare's neck. "Can't say I've ever seen anything quite like it in all my travels. Dust that dances, memories that linger long after the people who made them have gone." He smiled slightly. "Though I suppose you're more interested in that good hay you found than in ghost stories, aren't you?" The mare huffed softly against his hand, more concerned with the grain he offered than with his philosophical musings. Her practical focus grounded him, a reminder that extraordinary experiences didn't change the basic requirements of daily existence: food, shelter, forward movement along the road of life. Rising, he tended to his mare and prepared a simple breakfast from his dwindling provisions. As he ate, he found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the center of the barn floor, where the dust dancers had been most active. In daylight, it appeared perfectly ordinary, just packed earth marked by decades of disuse and the occasional drift of debris brought in by wind and weather. Yet something had changed in his perception of the space. What had initially appeared as merely convenient shelter now felt significant, as if the old barn held importance beyond its physical structure. Joshua found himself reluctant to leave, though continuing his journey was necessary if he hoped to reach the next settlement before his supplies ran out entirely. After breakfast, he packed his belongings with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to frequent relocation. Each item had its place in saddlebag or bedroll, the practiced routine requiring little conscious thought. This automatic quality of his movements allowed his mind to wander, considering what he might share of last night's experiences when he reached the next town. Most frontier settlements had their ghost stories, their local legends, their tales of mysterious happenings that defied conventional explanation. Usually these stories were told with a certain knowing humor, a tacit understanding that while entertaining, they weren't to be taken too seriously by rational adults. But what Joshua had witnessed transcended ordinary ghost tales. There had been no fear in it, no sense of warning or disturbance, only beauty, melancholy, and a peculiar affirmation of life's persistence beyond apparent ending. When he had packed his belongings and saddled his mare, Joshua paused at the barn door for a final look at the interior. On impulse, he withdrew his fiddle once more and played a brief passage from Moonlight on the Prairie, just enough to suggest the complete melody without performing it fully. The notes hung in the air of the empty barn, resonating against the ancient timbers and filling the space with momentary warmth. No dust rose to dance in the direct morning light, but Joshua didn't need that confirmation. He understood now why old Theo returned year after year, why some places held power beyond rational explanation. It wasn't about ghostly manifestations or supernatural phenomena, but about the imprint of human experience, joy, love, loss, connection, embedded so deeply in a location that it became part of its essential nature. "Thank you for the shelter," he said aloud to the empty barn, "and for the reminder that beauty persists, even in abandoned places." With that, Joshua led his mare out into the morning sunshine and mounted up, turning the horse's head toward the western trail that would eventually lead to the next small town on his circuit. As they rode away from Willowbrook's forgotten dance barn, he found himself already composing a new melody in his mind, one that captured the bittersweet wonder of what he had experienced there, a tune about time and dust and memories that refused to fade, about love that transcended ordinary limitations of life and death. He would play it in the saloons and at the gatherings that awaited him, and though he would share old Theo's tale with appreciative audiences, Joshua knew that some aspects of his night in the barn would remain private, a personal encounter with mystery that defied complete explanation but enriched his understanding of the world's hidden depths. As he rode, a soft nicker from his mare drew his attention to movement in the field beside them. A beautiful chestnut horse stood watching them pass, its coat gleaming in the morning sun. Though it wore no saddle or bridle, something about its alert posture and direct gaze suggested it was no ordinary wild animal. When Joshua reined in his own mount to look more closely, the chestnut tossed its head once, then turned and galloped away toward a rise crowned with ancient oak trees. Curious despite his plans to make good distance before midday, Joshua adjusted his course to follow. The chestnut kept just ahead of him, occasionally looking back as if to ensure he still followed, leading him on a winding path through meadows bright with wildflowers until they crested the rise. There Joshua discovered what the mysterious horse had apparently wanted him to find: a small, carefully tended cemetery enclosed by a wrought iron fence that had somehow maintained its integrity despite the years. Dismounting, Joshua secured his mare to the fence and cautiously entered through the gate that stood partially open, as if in invitation. Inside, perhaps 24 grave markers stood in neat rows, some simple wooden crosses, others more elaborate stone monuments. Most showed the inevitable weathering of years exposed to harsh frontier conditions, but all remained legible, their inscriptions speaking of lives lived and concluded in this once thriving community. Near the center, beneath the spreading branches of a juniper tree, 2 graves lay side by side. The first bore a stone marker reading Thomas Sheridan, 1856-1905, beloved son and faithful foreman of Willowbrook. Beside it stood a newer wooden cross with the simple inscription, Elizabeth Winters Sheridan, 18591-952. At last they danced together. Understanding washed over Joshua in a quiet wave. The date of Thomas's death matched exactly the date of the final dance at Willowbrook that old Theo had described, and Elizabeth, the inscription suggested she had maintained her connection to Thomas despite his untimely death, perhaps even considered herself his wife in spirit, if not in legal fact. Most striking, however, was how recently her cross had been replaced, likely within the past year given its condition. Someone was still tending these graves, still honoring a love story that had begun more than 70 years ago and transcended even death, if the phenomena in the barn were to be believed. As Joshua stood contemplating this, a soft sound from behind made him turn. A young woman stood at the cemetery gate, perhaps 25, dressed in the practical clothing of a frontier woman who worked the land, but with a grace to her bearing that suggested education and refinement beneath the functional exterior. Her hair, the rich brown of fertile soil, was twisted into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and her eyes, when they met his, were the clear green of spring leaves. "I see Copper brought you here," she said, nodding toward the chestnut horse that now stood alert at her approach. "He has good instincts about people." "Your horse?" Joshua asked, somewhat at a loss for more coherent response, given the unexpected encounter. She nodded, entering the cemetery and joining him beneath the juniper tree. "My grandfather's originally. He seems to live forever, that one." Her gaze shifted to the graves before them. "I see you found them." "Thomas and Elizabeth," Joshua confirmed, studying her face and finding familiar elements that suggested relation. "You're connected to them somehow." "Elizabeth was my grandmother," she explained. "Though I never knew Thomas, of course. He died long before I was born, before my father was born even." She gestured toward the wooden cross. "I replace it every spring. Grandfather, Theo, used to do it, but his hands aren't as steady with tools as they once were." Understanding crystallized in Joshua's mind. "Theodore Willard," he said, "the dance caller. He's your grandfather." Surprise flickered across her features. "You know my grandfather?" "We met last night," Joshua explained, "at the old barn. He comes there every year on June 2nd, he said." "The anniversary," she confirmed softly. "He never misses it, rain or shine, no matter how his joints pain him now." Her expression softened further. "Did he tell you the story then? About Thomas and Elizabeth and their last dance?" Joshua nodded. "And I saw it too, or something like it. The dust in the barn, moving like dancers when I played my fiddle." For a moment, he feared she might think him touched in the head or spinning tales, but her expression showed no surprise or disbelief, only a quiet acceptance, as if his experience confirmed something she had long suspected but rarely heard articulated by others. "Grandmother Elizabeth used to say that love creates echoes that never truly fade," she said after a contemplative pause. "That Thomas waited for her in that barn all those years, patient as only the departed can be. I always thought it was her way of coping with grief, but after she passed," she shook her head slightly, as if still coming to terms with her own experiences. "I've felt it too. Seen things in the dust and light that can't be explained by ordinary means." "You've seen them dance?" Joshua asked, intrigued by this unexpected connection. "Not exactly dance," she clarified, "but I've seen the dust move against natural patterns when I visit the barn, especially at certain times, sunset or when the light filters through in a particular way. And once, when I brought my father's old harmonica and played it just to pass the time while sheltering from a sudden shower, The dust seemed to respond, to gather and swirl in ways that dust simply shouldn't. They stood in reflective silence for a moment, both gazing at the graves that marked the physical conclusion of lives whose influence clearly extended far beyond their formal ending. The morning sun warmed the air around them, birdsong punctuated the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance a cow lowed plaintively. All ordinary sounds of frontier life, continuing its cycles despite individual departures. "I'm Sarah," the young woman finally said, extending her hand. "Sarah Willard, schoolteacher in Oak Ridge." That's the town that grew up around the railroad station, and caretaker of what little remains of Willowbrook's story. Joshua took her offered hand, noting its strength and the calluses that spoke of practical work balanced against the gentleness of her grip. "Joshua McKay," he replied. "Traveling musician, lately of nowhere in particular." Something in her direct gaze, a blend of practical groundedness and openness to mystery, drew Joshua like few people ever had. It reminded him of old Teo, yet carried its own distinctive quality, a youthful version of the same wisdom perhaps, or wisdom's precursor, genuine curiosity balanced by respect for what might lie beyond conventional understanding. "Would you like to come back to town with me?" Sarah asked, the invitation spontaneous yet thoughtful. "Grandfather will want to know you found the cemetery, that Copper led you here, and perhaps," she hesitated briefly, "perhaps we could talk more about what you experienced, about the music that seems to call them forth." Joshua considered his original plans, the next town on his loosely defined circuit, potential earnings from performances there, supplies he needed to replenish, and found them suddenly less compelling than the opportunity before him. 3 weeks on the road with no destination in mind, and now an invitation that felt like the beginning of a new chapter rather than merely the next page of his wandering existence. "I'd like that," he said simply, finding in those 3 words a commitment to possibility he hadn't anticipated when he'd sought shelter in an abandoned barn just 24 hours earlier. As they walked back to their horses, Joshua glanced over his shoulder toward the graves beneath the juniper tree. For a brief moment, so fleeting he might have imagined it, he thought he saw 2 figures standing there, a man and woman with arms extended toward each other as if about to begin a dance. Then a cloud passed over the sun, changing the quality of light, and the apparition, if it had ever been there, vanished. Whether real or imagined, the experience filled him with a sense of completion, as if some cycle had reached its natural conclusion, some pattern had found its resolution. The doors that tragedy had closed for Thomas and Elizabeth had somehow, across decades and through mysterious means, opened new possibilities for those who came after. "Thank you," Joshua whispered to the wind, to the memory of dust that moved against natural law, to the love that had persisted beyond mortal limitations and reached across time to touch a solitary fiddler, seeking only physical shelter but finding something far more profound. As they mounted their horses, Joshua on his trail-worn mare, Sarah on the enigmatic copper whose intervention had brought them together, he found himself already composing a new melody in his mind. Not a mournful tribute to lost love, but a hopeful celebration of connection that persisted across time and circumstance, of patterns that repeated with variations across generations, of music that could bridge the gap between what was and what might yet be. "Your grandfather mentioned you play piano," Joshua said as they rode side by side toward Oak Ridge, recalling something old Theo had mentioned in passing. Sarah nodded, a smile brightening her features. "Since childhood. Self-taught mostly, though I had some formal lessons when I attended school back east." The church let me rescue their old upright when they got their new one. It's a bit temperamental, but we understand each other. Perhaps, Joshua suggested, surprised by his own boldness, we might play together sometime. Fiddle and piano make fine companions in the right repertoire. I'd like that, she replied, echoing his earlier words with a warmth that suggested she recognized the invitation extended beyond mere musical collaboration. Behind them, in an abandoned barn where dust sometimes moved when music played, two figures completed their eternal waltz in the darkness. Not ghosts in the frightening sense, but memories so powerful they had shaped the very fabric of reality around them, creating a pocket of time and space where love transcended ordinary limitations and reached across the years to influence lives not yet begun, when theirs had ended. The slow dance of dust and time continued, invisible now in the daylight, but no less real for being unseen, like hope, like memory, like the connections between souls that persist beyond all rational explanation and all physical constraints. In its graceful, endless movements lay the greatest mystery and the deepest truth, that love, once created, never truly vanishes from the world, but continues to shape it in ways both subtle and profound, calling to those who might hear, guiding those who might follow, offering shelter to those who might otherwise remain forever wanderers on the frontier of human experience. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.